Railroading revolutionized life in the Catawba Valley. Tracks came and the pace of business accelerated. Futures changed for towns along the line. When the Western North Carolina Railroad came across Catawba County, few expected Hickory to leap to the forefront as a rail center, but it did. The unique development of our communities owe a lot to the lines that came our way back then.
North Carolina, and as of Western North Carolina, wanted railroad. That was the only way to move around beside wagons and or mules and or dusty roads and such. And so in the 1840s as well as in the 1850s, railroad fever gripped the state. And the state, of course, jumped on the bandwagon.
Railroading in North Carolina was started with an effort called the North Carolina Railroad, which stretched off to Goldsboro in the eastern part of the state. After it was completed, they endeavored to make the Western North Carolina Railroad extension. The Western North Carolina Railroad reached Catawba County in late 1859, passed through Hickory, exactly where it is now, and at the outbreak of the War of Northern Aggression, it stopped in 1860-61 at Camp Vance, which is about a point 3 miles east of Morganton.
During the war, railroad construction was very, very nil. Then after the war, railroad building was resumed to Asheville in points west. As far as coming to Hickory or Hickory Tavern, I believe, it's just a matter of, like the highways of today are, you've got to get more and more people. Horace Greeley said, "Go west, young men." And go west in North Carolina, they did with railroad building.
As soon as trains began to stop regularly, Hickory became a boom town. The path of the railroad stretched west and gave farmers an opportunity to sell goods out of the immediate area. The possibility of other types of business ventures also began to be realized. A rail line through town was a prized possession.
Railroad building of that time, of that age, probably where you were going through small towns and our small villages. And as the railroads came through, those that had the railroads prospered, and those that were bypassed didn't prosper.
At the time, Newton was left off of the main line. Newton was the county seat city, and because of bad geography, it was left off the main line just for expedience. A spur was built from Conover to Newton, and it was served that way. As a matter of fact, Newton had to go back to the state legislature in the mid-1880s and force the railroad to reroute its main line. If you look at a map of Catawba County, you'll notice the railroad does a U. It goes into Newton. And it does that because the charter of the Western North Carolina Railroad said it had to pass through every county seat along the route. But with that 20-year head start, with the coming of the Chester and Lenoir narrow gauge, Hickory really had a boom as compared to the other surrounding towns.
The railroad brought commerce, and the railroad brought progress for everybody, but everybody didn't grow in Hickory's proportion. Hickory wasn't growing like Asheville was, and Asheville wasn't growing like Charlotte was, but yet both had railroads.
In Catawba County, Hickory grew to prominence as the primary stop along the Western North Carolina Railroad. Due in part to the location of industry beside the tracks, Piedmont Wagon moved its factory from down by the Catawba River to West Hickory to be able to ship their wagons nationwide. The timber company Hutton and Bourbonnais located its mill along the line for the same reason. But as growth came, so did other railroads.
After the Civil War, railroad companies were financed with northern money, and a lot of communities in the South did not want northern money or northern railroads to come through their town. So they opted to go to, when a survey crew came through, we don't want you, we don't want any northern money. But several years later, they realized their folly, and they had to build short lines, or lines that went between their town and the main line.
One of those other railroads trekked from north to south instead of east to west. The line was built in a cooperative effort between businessmen and the towns the railroad would serve. Railroad service eventually ran from Chester, South Carolina to Lenoir, North Carolina, via Rock Hill, Gastonia, Dallas, Lincolnton, Maiden, Newton, Hickory, Granite Falls, Sawmills, and Hudson.
In Chester, South Carolina, Dr. Abraham de Vega met with George Harper of Lenoir. The two towns had markets that were just begging for each other. You had beef and timber in Lenoir. You had cotton and grain in South Carolina. By building a railroad to connect Chester with Lenoir, the markets for each were paying double the price what they were bringing at their own hometown rate. So you'd have plenty of room for profits in their respective markets, still be able to absorb all the shipping costs. This was proposed in 1872, which was at the advent of the narrow gauge movement, which again had a lot of options philosophically going its way as far as building costs, things like that. Because of a lot of fighting between the towns, including Hickory, Hickory did not want the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge to come through town because they already had a railroad. They even tried to get a railroad to expand from Lincolnton, a standard gauge railroad to expand from Lincolnton to Hickory and keep the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge out. But there was a lot of bickering, a lot of fighting. Finally, by 1880, it was a go. The railroad reached Lincolnton. By 1884, June 5th, 1884, a gold spike was driven in Lenoir, which was the completion of the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge.
Chester and Lenoir built narrow gauge because it's cheaper. And at the time of their building, they weren't planning to connect with anybody or to, they just weren't planning to, in other words, they were planning to keep their cars on their own line. And the standard gauge lines of the 50s were really 5-foot gauge. And they had a problem too, because a lot of lines were either the 6-foot gauge, 5-foot gauge, 3-foot gauge, and you had all these various gauges, and yet a train could only go so far to the end of its track. And if its connection was a 5-foot gauge, then it either had to be transferred by hand into other cars. And so it was adopted that 4 feet 8.5 inch would be a standard gauge throughout the United States. And so most railroads converted to that gauge.
Railroads operated to make a profit for stockholders, which meant the lines passed through the hands of different owners from time to time. Before the 20th century began, the Chester and Lenoir narrow gauge was sold. Its name was changed to the Carolina and Northwestern, along with its track to standard gauge. The Western North Carolina Railroad that ran west through Hickory became part of Southern Railway. The changes signified greater growth and cooperation between the lines to haul more freight and more passengers.
Hickory started booming about 1906 with regards to the railroad and had its first switch engine placed there. We had a yard in downtown Hickory. Well, it was said for many years that Hickory was very protective of its status with being the Western Trade Center on the Western North Carolina Railroad. And when the Chester-Lenoir narrow gauge came through, it fought bitterly with towns along the line to not get it to come through Hickory. Dr. William Roby of the Davenport College in Lenoir launched quite a tirade. He even said Western North Carolina, or excuse me, Caldwell County and Watauga counties have built up Hickory, made her what she is. She has no self-sustaining trade without them. He also said that if everybody followed Hickory's attitudes, The state would be defined by an area 2 miles wide and 500 miles long, which was a reference to just booming along the railroad and nowhere else in the state. So you had a little pathway of success.
The success of the railroad meant success for industries that relied on this transportation source. Furniture manufacturing made good use of the lines. Trains carried raw materials to the factories, then finished products toward customers.
1906, Lenoir was starting to get a world renown. It started its furniture building, had a lot of timber, and Hickory was the major rail connection with the Southern Railway. The Carolina and Northwestern, which served Lenoir, while a very good railroad, was not near the extent of the Southern Railway. So Hickory was the terminal, the stopping point for everything that came from Lenoir and went to Lenoir.
The furniture industry in Lenoir was dependent on wood, and yet to the west and the north you had stands of virgin timber. And the only way at the time, before the coming of the railroad, was to get it by oxen and wagon, so forth, and drag logs to a certain location for a portable sawmill, and they cut it up into planks, but it was costly, and so what they did was the lumber railroad was born.
Along with the growth of other towns, Lenoir continued to boom for the next 30 years as the furniture capital of the world, along with Hickory. So you had all this feeding on it. And so you had the junction of these two railroads, of the Carolina and Northwestern to Lenoir, the Southern Railway at Hickory.
As time went on, the railroad was used as the only source to haul in lumber to the furniture industry in Lenoir. But when it was depleted, the railroad had to move further and further west to satisfy the lumber mills and also the furniture industry in Lenoir.
Trains hauled a lot of lumber out of the northwestern mountains. Eventually, the Carolina and Northwestern stretched to the remote northern Caldwell County towns of Mortimer and Edgemont, which also became a popular 20th century resort town. Tourists came for the scenery. Even former President Theodore Roosevelt is said to have visited. The passenger business on the railroad was significant in the days before roads were paved and most people owned their own vehicles.
Railroads hauled nearly as many passengers as they did freight. Passengers wanted to see the wilds. They wanted to see the wilds of western North Carolina. They wanted to see the wilds of eastern North Carolina. But then again, here is the only way to travel. And they provided sleepers, dining cars. You could almost go anywhere you wanted to go. When I was a freshman in the Lenoir in 1955, I would go back and forth between Morganton and Hickory by train, and it cost $2.50 for me to do so, and of which I've still got a ticket of one of those particular runs. So there wasn't much money going on, and there was, around the turn of the century, when everybody was traveling by train, just as much as you got in your major airports today. All this crowd used to be in railroad depots.
Hickory's place of importance along the line was further cemented by the location of the new Carolina and Northwestern maintenance shop.
In 1911, another event happened when the shops of the Carolina and Northwestern burned down in Chester, South Carolina. Hickory competed with Newton and Lenoir and even Whitnall and Sawmills for the location of the new shops. Hickory won the bid, and shops were opened in 1912, and they were state-of-the-art shops in 1912. It was the only facility between Salisbury and Asheville. It served both the Carolina and Northwestern and the Southern Railway, and in 1923, the boys at the shops even built, from scratch, a locomotive. And that locomotive served on the line from 1923 to 1941. They built everything from scratch except for the boiler. And the Hickory Daily Record at the time said Just as engines are ordered from other plants for fine automobiles, a Baldwin boiler was ordered for this fine new engine. And it even had features that Bragg engines of the Southern Railway cannot boast of. So it was a thrill to discover that had been done. But it's there documented plain as day. Number 167, made its maiden run from Hickory to Granite Falls.
Since railroads came into being, state and federal governments have regulated their rates. But still, railroads had no competition.
Well, since they were the only game in town and there were no trucks or no surface transportation, they could primarily dictate the traffic, run the trains, and in turn charge what they wanted to. Well, railroads at the beginning of the 20th century had no highways to continue with, no trucks to continue with, no nothing. They were the game in town. And as roads progressed and they got hard, that is, they were paved or they were improved, trucks became apparent, and they offered a cheaper rate. They could go get the product. They could go get the product and deliver it to a proposed customer, where the railroad could only take it to their station.
Getting a train from one end of the line to the other was a complex job, requiring a number of people in different capacities. Bob Gant worked the short line between Chester and Lenoir for over 30 years.
December the 2nd, 1940, I made my first trip. And that's when my age started, seniority. That was back when steam engines was here. I was a brakeman for 10 years till 1950, and I got promoted to conductor, and I was conductor from then till 1973. Doctor made me quit work.
The work of men on the railroad is epitomized by the experience of Bob Gant and the variety of jobs he handled throughout his career.
Back then, there was a conductor, an engineer and a fireman, a conductor, a flagman, and a brakeman. I done most of my work flagging, ride the cab, caboose. I made my first trip as a flagman out of Chester, South Carolina. Headed to Chester on Sunday on an extra going down there with coal. We made 14 hours on Monday coming up the road. Worked with my dad, first trip. We made 14 hours. I thought I'd made a big day, boy. Out there in the snow, the sleet, rain. It didn't make no difference. You worked Christmas Day, New Year's Day, Thanksgiving. Some of the biggest days I ever made was Christmas Day. I have left Lenoir at night with 25, 30, and 35 cars of furniture. Nothing but furniture. We used to haul coal, lumber, cotton. We used to haul a lot of coal for Lancaster, South Carolina, and Chester, and all up and down Lincoln, Gastonia. Hauled most all their coal. And hauled all the coal for Lancaster mills, Lancaster cotton mills. They had mills all over Chester and Lancaster. And we'd have, or sometimes we'd leave Newton with 17, 18 cars of coal. With one engine, you'd have to double in the maiden end, leave part of it at the foot of the hill and take part of it to maiden, come back and get the rest of it, go back again. Sometimes I'd walk the top of the cars, like coming in the maiden, walk the top of the cars, leave down there about the time they hit the foot of the maiden hill, and walk the top of the cars up to maiden to help do the work up there.
The line through Wilson's Creek Gorge carried people and lumber down alongside the river until when, in July of 1916, water covered the rails and washed most of the inventory away for the Ritter Lumber Company, located in Mortimer.
He had a booming operation from 1906 to 1916 just above Lenoir in the towns of Mortimer and Edgemont. And once 1916 came, it washed away 1 million feet of lumber. It destroyed his mills, and he pulled out shortly afterwards.
Service north of the Catawba River was restored after a little more than a month. But the road from Lenoir to Edgemont suffered from the loss of business and damage to the point that eventually the line was abandoned in 1938. Bob Gann's father was part of that crew.
He helped tie that track up there. And he got a piece of rail fell on his foot, and he couldn't do it anymore. He had to get off the job and lay off for a while. His foot healed up, and then I think they was finished up with it when he got, so he could go back to work.
Injury in the railroad industry loomed as a possibility that could possess severe consequences. The constant threat and occasional reality of an accident made Bob Gann's job sometimes dangerous.
There's one at above Hudson, right above Hudson, about a mile from Hudson up there, one afternoon. It's, well, my dad was conductor, and he come south out of Lenoir and crossed the trestle, and there was an extra going out of Hickory, and he crossed the trestle. He's the one that had the wreck with the double-header engine, steam engine. One steam engine went down in the trestle, and I forget how many boxcars went in there. And the fireman, he got killed. A fellow, Lloyd Martin from York, he was firing the second engine, and it's the one that went in the hole down in the creek, and he was under a boxcar load of lumber there and couldn't get out, couldn't get him out till they got to Derrick here and picked up the car. And we left Dallas one day. I mean, we was coming on up the road, coming down South Fork Hill. One engine jumped the track or something. Anyhow, the engine and tank went down the side of a hill, and the second engine stayed on the track, but the tank and coal went down the hill. And we come on into Hickory that night. There's one boxcar sitting up like this. Well, I was sitting up in a little cupola on top of the cab coming down the hill, and the air went down. Brakes went in emergency, and I seen what was happening, and I jumped down out of the cupola and started to the back end because I didn't know how close the front end was to the wreck, and you could feel them bump the train, rear of the train bumping into the rest of them down there. And I jumped off and run down there, and the conductor I was with, he was up in an empty boxcar, sitting just like that. He was in one end of it. I heard him, I asked somebody where D was, D Huffman. And he says, here I am. And he was in that boxcar sitting just about like that. And he ordered, where's Gann at? And I said, here I am.
Passengers were always a part of railroad service since its earliest days. But after World War II, trains served fewer and fewer travelers.
I think at one time at Morganton, I can speak for Morganton, up into the late 30s and early 40s, there were 6 passenger trains each way between Asheville and Salisbury. And so basically, you could go anywhere you want to, but not now. Passengers became somewhat of a weight around the railroad's neck. They had to provide the service for it, but yet they weren't making too much money.
Lenoir raised Cain. They wanted a train up there. Well, they promised them a switch engine in Lenoir. Told them to put them a switch engine up there if it'd let them cut the passenger train off. Well, it was a while before they put the switch engine up there, and they got to raising Cain. Boy, they were mad up there.
In the post-World War II world of railroading, a revolution was taking place. Steam engines were being replaced by a new power source, one much more powerful and economical. As the 1950s came, so did the diesel-powered locomotive.
Well, they'd pull more than steam engine. And they was a lot cleaner, didn't have no smoke to contend with, cinders. Didn't have no cinders to contend with. And I got to where I liked them pretty good.
While the visibility of the railroad declined, the city of Hickory continued to grow. The prominence of a rail yard in the downtown area began to cause problems for automobile traffic. By the early 1970s, Southern Railway moved the facilities out of town.
Hickory wanted the switching out of town. Claiming it delayed too much traffic at these crossings. And them long trains coming here after they got the diesels. I see the steam engine didn't haul but about, on the Asheville Road, they never did have but about 50 cars. That's what their steam engines pull, about 50 cars. Of course, they set off cars up and down the road and picked up cars up and down the road, and they handled all their coal steam engines. They had, oh Lord, I don't know how many trains they had, freight trains they had on the Asheville Division, going both ways.
Some of the old timers tell me there wasn't a city along the line that really liked having them through the center of town. But in '72, Southern Railway bought a small neighborhood at Oyama. It's a 10-track rail yard. Trains are made up daily. What happens is trains come in, drop off their cars that go to various local destinations. The local switching crew assembles the trains. Locals run out of here daily through the weekdays, and one does run on Saturday also. There's no activity there on Sunday. Oyama was a little community founded in 1906 officially, and it was named by the Southern Railway. Oyama is the name of a Japanese general. He's a field marshal, actually, who was a hero of the Japanese-Russo War in the early part of the century. It was a very big war between Japan and Russia. He was a hero. There happened to be a family of Japanese immigrants that lived in the area. The railroad had a passing siding here for many years. They had a telegraph station, and they named the area Oyama for these immigrants. The Catawba County, per se, didn't know that it had an area named Oyama, except when in 1906 there was a train wreck here. It was a head-on collision between Carolina and Northwestern and a Southern Railway trains, which shared the tracks between Newton and Hickory. A temporary track was laid around the wreckage, and as the train was trying to go over that temporary track, it too derailed. So you had 3 trains on the ground out here, and the newspapers just had a ball with it. And I remember the comment being, didn't know we had an area named Oyama? Neither did we until these 3 wrecks came along.
Trains continue to travel through the Catawba Valley each day. Some routes see more traffic than others, but the rails still run east to west across Catawba County, and a line still runs north into Caldwell County. And while they are less prominent than at one time, railroads continue to be an important transportation alternative.
They're hauling more freight than they ever have. It's true they're not that way as far as passengers, but if you go through and examine the history, the railroads really never made any money off of passengers to begin with. Freight traffic is so great that Norfolk Southern, which was the heir to the Southern Railway, had to cancel its excursion program simply because they have so much freight they can't shoehorn them in. So from that perspective, you know, a lot of goods, a lot of coal, wood, automobile parts, food still travels by rail, and because people aren't passengers, the only exposure we get are history programs or sitting at a grade crossing cussing because we can't cross the tracks because the train's coming.